I want to welcome everybody to this evening's session. It's the 19th of September 2020, this ongoing series looking at the centenary of the history of the Baha'i faith in Australia. And this is the 18th session that we've had, and we've travelled around the various Australian states. And this is, I mention this because this is the last of the sessions that look at one of the states or territories, and it's the Australian Capital Territory. From next week, we move to another type of theme, looking at some Baha'i experiences in rural areas and also the experiences of Persian Bahais who have arrived in Australia, amongst other topics. So tonight we focus on the Australian Capital Territory, and I have asked Michael and Ranjana Curtotti to be the host for this evening. Michael and Ranjana have been resident in the A.C.T. since 1989, and they're well placed to convene this evening and to put together a program. So thank you so much to Michael and Ranjana, and I'll hand over now to you for the session.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you for convening these amazing sessions that have created such a vibrant space for us all to connect with each other and to connect with the friends who've been here before us. We've got some wonderful speakers tonight, so thank you very much to all of our speakers. Helen Harrison, who will speak about the very beginnings of the faith here. Paul Stevenson, who will speak about the late 60s and early 70s. Parvaneh and Foad will take the story forward from there. And Natalie Mobini will present an overview of the journey of Canberra and its significance in a national sense as well as a local sense. So we've got, thank you to all the friends from so many different places who are joining us tonight. That's wonderful. And also wonderful that we have so many friends from Canberra. As we come to the end of the presentation, there'll be time to share reflections and thoughts and questions. And so please feel free to do that after the presenters have finished speaking. So each presentation will go for 15 or 20 minutes. And I think typically these sessions last for an hour and a half, or they're recorded for an hour and a half, but they can continue on as well after that. Without further ado, it's our great pleasure to introduce Helen Harrison. She was born in Canberra just before World War II. She was christened and confirmed at the historic St. John the Baptist Anglican Church in Reid, and learnt first about the faith in 1951 when she was aged 14 from her sister Margaret. She declared her faith in Baha'u'llah in 1952 and attended every Yerumbul summer school after leaving, until she left the country. She's served as a pioneer. She pioneered Tookoomba in 1959. So wonderful to see Canberra's role in the surrounding localities right from the very beginning. And she met Hilton Grigor there. They married in Canberra and had 3 children born in New South Wales. She also pioneered to Western Samoa in 1966 with her family during the 9-year plan. Her visa, however, was cancelled, and with the guidance of the House of Justice, she transferred to New Zealand. She's lived in Australia on and off. The majority of her life has been in Australia, but also she's very much lived many years in New Zealand as well, where she has family. So I'll hand over to Helen now. And Helen, I'll just start your screen share, and then feel free to start your presentation. And just a reminder, friends, if we could keep our microphones on mute until the presentations are over. So here we go, and hopefully this will work. Can't see her face. Where did it go? Oh. Here we go. Okay, so just get the right photo. Just bear with me. Okay, so over to you, Helen.
Right. Well, I'm not sure when. Oh, is this taken before the? This is the lake, before the lake, is it? I wasn't sure. Yes, Canberra was. I don't think Canberra was even a city in the beginning. I think it was when I was in high school it was declared a city because it reached 15,000 people. Well, the Mason House where I was brought up was halfway between. This is it. Halfway between the War Memorial and St John's Church, very appropriate. On the room on the left, take us back to May 1951. It was in this room that Margaret, after the overnight train from Sydney, came and told us that Christ had returned. And I had already, many years before, decided that he should return, probably because of what was happening during the war. And I had also learned about Muhammad from a little story. So I believed that Muhammad and Christ were the same. And so when she said Christ had returned, and of course I also knew about Zen Buddhism. So it just all fell into place for me like a jigsaw puzzle. And it was a very exciting time, really, you know, because all of a sudden one day I realized this is the day. This is the day we're living in, this important day. And it was so exciting. Anyway, I've got my notes here, and of course I've lost them for a moment. Noel, of course, and Margaret met in Sydney. Noel had contacted or been introduced to Avilda Reid, and who had in turn been taught the faith by the Fitzners, who had been taught by the Duns. So it was not terribly many generations away from our learning of the faith. The first thing that happened was people started to visit us from Sydney that I can recall. I pretty much remember Marriott Bolton. She gave us a whole pile of books, which I read, and Portals to Freedom, Gleanings, Bahai World Faith, and oh yes, and a little postcard of the shrine, which hadn't yet been opened. That was a great treasure. And soon after that, somehow I became aware that Pim Truman was living in Canberra on the other side of the city. And I went over there to see her on a couple of occasions. The whole family, they're very small. I think she had about 4 children. And we had public meetings. I remember Marriott giving one very spirited one at the YWCA in the Civic, which has probably been pulled down, that building, by now. And yes, I'm not sure exactly when I first went to summer school. It was at that very first year. Certainly I went to visit Margaret in Leeton. Yes, the next photo, we can go to that. So in September 52, Margaret and Noel got married. They had the Bahai wedding in Sydney on the Friday, and then they came to Canberra, and we had the wedding on the Saturday. There was a bit of argy-bargy with the minister at the church. He didn't want to marry a Bahai, but Mother persuaded him. And at that stage, we didn't know all the rules about Bahai marriage. It was after that we learnt that they should be conducted on the same day, with the Bahai wedding and the legal wedding or the church wedding. And of course, and that if people were both Baha'is, they shouldn't have a church wedding. So, but we didn't know that at the time. You can go on to the other. Okay. So it was about that year. I think by the time this photo was taken, I had declared as a Bahai, and I got into some really interesting discussions with my friends at school. Particularly, I remember the Anglican curate. I put him through a hard time because I'd read some answered questions. And so they sent the Archdeacon up to sort me out. So I took off to the Methodists instead, because they would let us knit. But it was interesting because I fired up my friends so much, they wanted to have Bahai classes. But of course that didn't happen. And the other interesting that happened at the school, and I'm not sure exactly when it was, but it was while I was still at high school, Shirin Fozdar came to the school to speak. Obviously the Bahais in Sydney had arranged this, and somehow, I mean, I was just 14, 15. I didn't have any sort of consultation with me about what should or shouldn't happen. But anyway, Shirin Fozdar came to the school in her sari and her dark hair, and she gave the talk about the equality of men and women. She'd learnt it off by heart, The Wings of the Bird. And yes, and that was very exciting. And then at lunchtime, we'd sit around, all the girls, and I'd tell them all about the faith. And that was very exciting. It was such an exciting time. And it was also new and different. Okay. You had another photo of my school. These are a lot of the kids that I would have told the faith about. And one of them who actually declared is not in the photo. This was a geography trip to Sydney. And yeah, lots of these girls were very close friends. And yeah, one of the boys, the tallest boy, he used to run the Tamworth country music festivals. Max, whatever his other name is, I've forgotten. Oh yes, and then of course, after 2 years, I went off to Sydney to train as a nurse. So it was virtually the same year that as I moved out, Margaret and Noel and the two little boys, Michael and Paul, moved into Canberra. And first of all, they lived out Deakin somewhere, because I can remember one night being there on a visit home, and there was Frank Wiss and Meg Degatardi and Noel, and we sat up till 3 o'clock in the morning, talk about all sorts of interesting things that we would now call scientific investigations. That was very exciting. In fact, my return visits to Canberra were also very, very interesting, and finding out all the people that my mother particularly was very active, teaching her friends and persuading them. And I remember Patricia Pennington, and of course Peter Vogel. I remember meeting Peter in a group of us. We went to some, I think it was the only nightclub in Canberra at the time. It was in Civic Centre. It was more of a restaurant, really. There wasn't any floor show or anything. And Peter was there. I remember that. And of course, we met him through the Danes who lived over the back fence for a while. There was the elderly couple and Anne and Peter eventually got married. And Peter, so, you know, I was coming and going from Canberra all that time. And the other things that happened when I was on home visits were Hands of the Cause visits. And, oh yes, I should have mentioned that Margaret's wedding, Frank Wiss was the best man. And, but I haven't got that photo. Margaret occasionally puts it on Facebook, though, I notice. So the two Hands of the Cause that I met in Canberra were, first of all, I think it was Enoch Alinga. He gave, Margaret and Noel used to have lots of gatherings at their place in Cliantha Street in O'Connor. And Enoch Alinga gave this talk. We came up from Cooma to meet him and to listen to him give this talk. And then on another occasion, William Sears came, and he slept in the caravan at the back of Margaret's house. And he gave this talk over in, I forget the name of the suburb. It's over between Reed and Duntroon. Anyway, this huge room full of people, and he talked for hours and hours. We hung on his every word. He was just wonderful. And the other person that I know that visited was Dr. Mahaja, and he stayed with my father and persuaded him that Masonic Lodge was not, you know, my father wouldn't join the faith because he was a Mason and all his mates were Masons. And but Mahaja sort of explained to him why it wasn't acceptable. The other thing that happened too when we were there, when we were on a visit, was Hilton, who I was trying to persuade him that I wasn't going to marry anybody unless they were a Bahai. So we went up to Canberra to go through the will and testament with Noel and Margaret. And that was a great thing to do. Everybody should do that before they declare, I think. And then, so then there was our wedding. And by the time we were married in 1959, my mother had declared by that stage, and we had the wedding at the registry office, and then we had the wedding at the same house, the same family home, the Masons. So that was really interesting. But in 1965, I think it was the beginning of the 9-year plan, Margaret and Noel came back from convention and they decided they were going to pioneer to Papua New Guinea. And they were able to do that fairly comfortably because Noel got a good job with the coffee board up there. And the next year we went pioneering to Western Samoa. So, and I've been able to come back to visit Canberra, especially when the centre was open. But that's all my story of Canberra that I can think of at the moment. So I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was a beautiful presentation, and so special to have you here with us this evening. The first person to declare their faith in Canberra, and it's of special significance that it was a youth. And I think your story is an inspiration to every generation of youth. And so thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. So Paul we'll just get ourselves organised so we can introduce Paul, and then Paul can present his presentation. So,
go ahead. Hi, aloha everyone. I wanted to introduce Paul Stevenson, who's our next speaker. He was born and raised in Mudgee, New South Wales. He studied forestry at the Australian National University, then pioneered to the Indigenous community of the Tiwi Islands in the Northern Territory. He later married Susan and moved back to Canberra and the Queanbeyan area to teach at the University of Canberra. After the birth of their 3 children in Queanbeyan, the family pioneered to the Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean, where Paul managed the national park there. This was followed by 6 years pioneering to Norfolk Island, where he managed the National Park and Botanic Gardens. The family returned again to Canberra, Queanbeyan area in 1998, so that their children could undertake tertiary studies, and Paul continued to work with the Commonwealth Park Service. Paul was raised in a Bahai family, and he has served for over 30 years on local assemblies and as a delegate to National Convention. He was also a member of the Bahai Council for New South Wales and the A.C.T. from 2000 to 2011, and is currently serving on the advisory board for the maintenance and development of the Bahai Gardens at the Bahai World Centre. He has some memories of the development of the Bahai community in the A.C.T. in the 1960s and 70s, and he will share these memories with us tonight. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Ranjana, and greetings to everyone. It's wonderful to see so many friends from many different periods and many different places. So I'll just organise the screen if I can. And So I'd like to take over in the sort of period that Helen was referring to earlier, and I'd also like to acknowledge the hospitality that she gave my parents and our family in 1962 in Cooma. So I remember the family there, and I think Glenn might have been maybe one year old at the time, but wonderful memories. Now, this is an image of the Bahai Centre, and a lot of us tend to think that it's been there forever, but that's not necessarily the case. And I want to talk about some processes, some personalities and patterns from the 1960s and a little bit into the 1970s. And already Ranjana has noted that I've had several windows of opportunity to observe the A.C.T community and its history. And the first visit was to a regional teaching conference in Canberra in 1962. I would have been probably 12 or 13 years of age. And most of you who live in Canberra probably don't realise that there's a little conference hall on the corner of National Circuit and Brisbane Avenue, but that's where the teaching conference was held. But there was also a window in from the 60s and 70s when I was studying at the ANU, and then several other opportunities in between pioneering. Now, I'd also like to apologise for some poor images because I have to deal with whatever I've got available while we're travelling. So some of the things might seem a bit scrappy, but hopefully there will be some things that will be of interest to you. Now, what was Canberra like then? And it certainly was not like what it is today. And the Australian Capital Territory was excised from New South Wales in two portions early last century, and that included what we generally know as the Australian Capital Territory and also the Jervis Bay Territory. And it was assumed in those days that every capital, every national capital should have a harbour, and there was going to be a railway line that was going to join the harbour for the Australian Capital Territory with the main part. And this is relevant later on. The population was about 28,000 when Helen became a Bahai. And in 1960, it was up to 51,000 compared to the 450,000 that it is at the moment. There are 6 university campuses, and the ANU was the first of those established in 1948. I understand as several huts in what we know as the university precinct. Most people don't realise that Indigenous people were banned from the ACT from the 1930s until the late 1950s, possibly early 1960s. And any Aboriginal person who was found in the ACT was arrested and taken to Jervis Bay. It's a rather shameful part of our history. Again, it has relevance later on. The White Australia policy blocked the migration of non-Europeans to Australia. And that's one of the reasons why it took so long for Persians to migrate to Australia. And in those days, there were no mobile phones. Communication was limited to postal mail, telegrams and landline phones. And that certainly made life a little bit different to the social media that we've got at the moment. What was Canberra like in the 1960s? And here we have the suburbs that were there in the 1960s. There was no Belconnen, no Woden. They were just scraping Woden for development there. No Western Creek and no Tuggeranong. There was just what we now would call the inner north and the inner south. And that was the limit to Canberra. And we've had 2 Bahai centres. And the first one where the number one is located there, was in Kingston, and that was in 1969. And the second one is the one that we currently know, that was dedicated in 1999. The Bahai Centre in Kingston was just a single room above the greens. Is it the greens or the law? Yeah, the greens in Kingston, about where Beaker Photographics is, but upstairs. And when the community looked at the budget that it had of, I think it was $1,700, not a cent went to the National Assembly or to the National Fund. It all went on rent. And so it was decided to close that particular beginning of a Bahai Centre in the ACT. So the development of a community that we're looking at was development locally, but also very much regionally. So it's already mentioned that Helen pioneered to Cooma, her mother, Pauline, and Jean Harvey pioneered to what is now Eurobadalla, and various other people to different regional centres. But this was a characteristic of the Bahai community at that time, that people were relatively mobile. The development of the LSA was also something of interest. It is one LSA for a city of 460,000. Brisbane is one of the few places that approximates that in terms of the physical size that has to be covered by one LSA. The development of the feast is also interesting. I remember attending feasts at University House at the ANU, which we rented for the evening. And at the end of the spiritual part of the feast, the chairman said, well, since everyone was at the LSA meeting, we don't have to have the business part of the feast, so bring on the cup of tea. And I was thinking, as a youth and not a member of the assembly, that I was left out, as were a couple of other members of the community. But this was part of the learning process that the community was going through. But it's also interesting that some people introduce things from their personal experience into the Bahai community. And again, I was surprised that in those early days that I was advised that if you haven't attended 3 feasts in a row, then your voting rights would be removed. And I thought, where did that come from? And I asked the question, and the answer was, well, this is what we do in the Rotary Club, so we may as well do it in the Bahai community. Of course, that was also corrected. And I've spoken about the development of a physical presence, and we now have a very elegant Bahai Centre on a beautiful block of land. In terms of Persian migration, I understand that the first Persian to come to Australia was a little girl who stayed with the Blewitts in O'Connor. And from memory, her name was Amira Khamsi, whose parents were pioneering to Indonesia. But the first family to arrive in the ACT was the Sazagar Ahadizad family in, I think, 1968. And they were initially staff for the Swiss ambassador. After that, Bijan and Therese Vadat, because they came from the UK, they weren't constrained as much by the remnants of the White Australia policy that other Persian Baha'is were. Then, of course, there were many refugees after 1979 when the government developed special policies for Baha'i refugees. But it's also interesting that there was a development in Canberra that could be seen as along the lines of socioeconomic development. There were 4 Baha'is who were very financially literate. I understand that this was Gus Thames, Noel Blewett, who was the chief instigator of that, Peter de Vogel, and also John Kirby. They developed the Civic Permanent Building Society, which was a very successful operation. It was finally bought out by the St. George Bank. I want to talk about a couple of personalities, and the first of these will be Peter de Vogel. And I don't want to take too much of the thunder of Natalie, so I'll talk about him in general terms, but he was one of my mentors. And he was an NSA member for 27 years, National Secretary for 10 years, Treasurer for 16 years, founder of the Office of Government Affairs, and several other important national developments within the national Bahai community. I also want to talk a little bit about Frank Wiss, who was Knight of Baha'u'llah for the Cocos Keeling Islands. I'd also like to talk a little bit about Munira Bland, and as I mentioned, the first permanent resident Bahai family from Iran. And I'd also like to talk about Harry Penrith, the first resident Indigenous Bahai in the mid-1970s. And again, acknowledging the pioneers regionally to Kuma, and I guess 1961, so Helen has confirmed that. Pioneers to Eurobadala. Again, I've mentioned Mace and Jean Harvey, and pioneers to Queanbeyan. Again, later than the other two communities in about 1972, Carrie Scott and Rod Fitterman, who responded after the youth conference in 1972 and spent several months in Queanbeyan. But then Peter Manibi, who we now know as Peter Danza, and Bill Weiss pioneered and started the community properly with Trevor Brentnell and Eleanor Burdett. Trevor as a youth and Eleanor Burdett in her retirement, making the LSA in Queanbeyan. Now, talking about Peter, he was born in the Netherlands, trained in hotel management. He migrated to Australia in 1951, declared in Canberra in 1956, and met Mother Dunn. As I said before, he was a member of the National Assembly for many years in several doses, and treasurer as well. When I first met him, he was the treasurer, and then he became the first full-time national secretary in 1968. Before that, Jim Heggie had been the long-term national secretary, and I think 12 years he was the national secretary, and it really impinged on Jim's health. And my mother reported that she looked across the table, and Jim Heggie's, when the election for secretary was announced across the NSA table, Jim Heggie's shoulders rose an inch and Peter de Vogel's shoulders shrunk an inch in response to what was announced. Peter facilitated several national conventions in Canberra, I think the Albert Hall in 1973 and Erindale in 1982. He pioneered to Belgium with his wife and family in 1975, but had to return because of health difficulties with one of the girls in 1977. Again, Peter was elected to the National Assembly and continued to function in that capacity for, again, many years. But the thing I wanted to point out was that he was a great mentor to many young people, including myself. When I first arrived in Canberra, he had actually organised for me to study forestry at the ANU in preparation for pioneering to the Tiwi Islands. And so I worked with him for several months. He was an architectural model maker at that stage. Following his, he'd been an assistant manager at the Hotel Canberra, which is now the Hyatt on the banks of Lake Burley Griffin. He was a wonderful person, and we should know more about him. And there's a copy of this April 95 bulletin article that I've sent to Michael and Ranjana that you can refer to if you like. When he passed away, the Universal House of Justice sent this wonderful acknowledgement of his contribution. And the photograph on the left shows Peter on the left, together with members of the National Spiritual Assembly and an auxiliary board member at the time, Howard Harwood. And the photo on the right shows Peter with David Bailey, Beverly Stafford and Ray Meyer. And Ray was another important character in relation to this, particularly with the establishment of the community in Goulburn. And I was talking to Nance Meyer about 10 years ago, and she said over 50 Bahais had declared in Goulburn alone, and then had distributed or drifted away from the faith. I wanted to talk also about Frank Wyss, and again, another wonderful person who was a significant Bahai in the A.C.T. He was an early Bahai youth. He and his sister Lillian, who was pictured there, they both declared in 1944, and they came from Swiss parents, and they lived in Tamor, which is 2 stations up from Yerenbul. He learnt the faith from the Bolton children, Stanley Jr. and Antoinette, who was studying at a college at Bowral. He studied chiropractic in the US from 1946 to 48 and came back to Australia, was elected to the National Assembly, but he decided in 1955 that he would pioneer to the Cocos-Keeling Islands, and he became a Knight of Baha'u'llah. He was only there for 17 days, and he was thrown off the island because it was a privately owned island by the Clooney's Ross family. And there's an interesting story about this because he got permission to go on pilgrimage a few months later, and Shoghi Effendi sat him on his right hand at the dinner table, and when they'd finished dinner, Shoghi Effendi unrolled the scroll of the Knights of Baha'u'llah and said, "Here is your name, Frank." And Frank objected. He said, "But Shoghi Effendi, you can't do that. I was only there for 17 days. But Shoghi Effendi said, "But you intended to stay." And I think there's a spiritual lesson in this in terms of God knows what our intentions are, and Frank's intention was understood. When he returned to Australia, he decided to pioneer to Papua New Guinea and went to Rabaul for some 13 years, returning to Australia and settling in Canberra in 1971. And he served as secretary of the LSA, and he was probably the most efficient secretary I've ever worked with on an assembly. He was then appointed as an auxiliary board member in 1973 for New South Wales, the ACT in Queensland, and Bijan Vadat was the protection board member who also lived in Macquarie, I think, at that stage in Canberra at the same time. They were auxiliary board members in parallel. Frank and Lillian are probably the only brother and sisters who are Knights of Baha'u'llah. Lillian became a Knight of Baha'u'llah for Samoa. This is a photograph of Munira Sazagar, or Munira Bland, with her mother Tuba Khanon. And I think that Parvaneh will be talking about Munira as well, so I won't take up too much time, but to acknowledge her contribution. Her family moved to Canberra from memory in 1968, and I remember in my first year at university going to the Swiss ambassador's residence on Melbourne Avenue and doing some English classes for the family a couple of times as they were becoming established. They became permanent residents in Canberra and the nucleus for most of Monira's family, the Hardizade family, to migrate to Australia, including her mother, who was a very gracious member of our community. Monira was a consistent and generous supporter of the Bahai community activities for some 52 years until her passing just a few months ago. Wonderful person. And this is a photograph that Farouk has shared with us of his wedding there with Monira in the red. And also there's a photograph on the right of Monira just in the background, but this was probably when at National Convention, when it was announced that the Bahai Centre property was being acquired. I suspect that Beverly Stafford was the secretary of the NSA at that stage. That's Madge Williams on the left and Hazel Booth between Beverly and Madge. But again, Monira, a very special lady. I also want to talk about Harry Penrith. Burnham, as he chose to be called later in life, but he was given the name Harry Penrith, and that's generally how we remember him. He was orphaned early in life and raised in institutions, notably at Kinsella Boys' Home near Kempsey. He really had a very difficult life beyond what most of us could imagine, but we won't go into that, other than to say that he went to Kempsey High School. He was elected school captain in his final year, and the school authorities, I think it was about 1957, the school authorities, the headmaster said, an Aboriginal cannot be a school captain, and the students went on strike. And as a compromise, the school staff accepted him as vice captain of the high school. He was an excellent athlete and played semi-professional football and was being considered for the Wallabies national team at one stage. He was guided to the faith by Greta and Orr Blake, and he occasionally visited in the A.C.T. From Wagga, where he had a position at Yanko Agricultural College, but he had to wait in Yass until after dark, because if he was picked up by the police in the A.C.T, he would be taken to Jarvis Bay. He married Leonie and moved to Canberra in 1973, working for Aboriginal hostels, and was personally very generous and hospitable. I remember in 1974, both Wellen and I lived with him and Leonie and their daughter Lua when Wellen first moved to the ACT, but a very special person. He was also a bit cheeky. In 1988, he flew to England, and this was in the bicentenary of European settlement in Australia, and he claimed Great Britain for the Indigenous people of Australia by planting the Aboriginal flag on the White Cliffs of Dover to indicate how artificial the original claim to Australia by Europeans was.
Well, I'm really reluctant to interrupt you. It's so wonderful, this presentation. But just to let you know, we're running short on time. So.
And I'm going to call it quits at that, Michael. And
no, I think if you introduce your remaining slides, that would be wonderful.
Just quickly, looking at patterns of organic growth and some of the things that have happened in the ACT that respond to developments in the Bahai community. The National Youth Conference, which was organised on short notice, probably one of the best photos of a Bahai gathering anywhere at John 23rd College, and I've put the names of various people there. It's not a good photo because I'm in it. I just happened to be there when the Canberra Times photographer was there. Also, just wanted to mention, and Natalie's probably going to talk about this as well, the proclamation of the International Year of Peace in 1985. I was involved in that in a little way. This last photograph shows you the chauffeur for the Bahai delegation, Hands of the Cause, councillor and NSA member. That's my father waiting in Government House for the official proclamation to continue. And I'll hand over to Parvaneh.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that was really very informative, and I learned so much. I think one of the outstanding Bahais that Canberra has also raised, you forgot to mention, is yourself. And later we'll probably hear more about you. Tonight also we have with us Monira Bland's son in the listening, so maybe he could share later on in the chat when we have time. So thank you so much, Paul. It was very interesting. So we move on. Michael will now introduce our next speaker.
So I'll introduce Parvaneh Shahbahrami and Foad Khorsandi together. Parvaneh and Foad are married. Parvaneh was born in Iran, in Mashhad, and arrived in Australia in 1984. She studied a Bachelor of Science, majoring in Mathematics and Information Technology at the La Trobe University in Melbourne. And she's been working at the ATO for over the last 29 years. And her current role is IT Program Manager. Parvaneh is currently serving as Secretary of the A.C.T. Assembly. She's a very devoted servant of Baha'u'llah and has made a wonderful contribution. Foad also was born in Iran and arrived in Australia in 1984. He completed an IT degree and worked as tutor and lecturer at different educational institutions. Currently, he's teaching and working as an interpreter. He and Parvaneh have 2 boys and a lovely daughter-in-law. And Foad also has a very distinguished record of service to the community. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about the work he's been involved in. So I'll share screen now. So, but yeah, over to you, Parvaneh. I think you wanted to make some comments before we share the screen.
Yes, no worries. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that kind introduction. And also, I just wanted to thank the organizers of this program for putting such a fantastic program together, and which not only give us the historical perspective of the Bahai community in Australia over the last 100 years, but over the last few months that I've been participating in this program, I noted that it brings the whole Bahai community together, where we can share our stories and our experiences, and also remember all those people who contributed and sacrificed to build the foundation of this beautiful Bahai community in this vast continent of Australia. Thank you. Next, tonight I've been asked to share with you the story of my life, or story of our lives and experiences in Canberra and A.C.T. And I cannot do that, or I cannot explain the significance of my experience here unless I give you a bit of a background about ourselves. The organizers of this program already identified the period of time after the revolution, after the Iranian Revolution, as a topic for discussion. And I believe that it will be presented in next couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to that. But I just wanted to highlight that what happened in Iran had a great impact on Australia, and changed the demographic of Australia significantly, and but provide further opportunities for growth. The revolution of Iran not only brought but challenges and crises for community of Bahais in Iran, but for the whole global Bahai community, as well as for Australian community. Australian community was not an exception, but Australian community played a very crucial role in this process. Many of you know better than me that Australian community at the time was a small community, but had very dedicated and brave believers in it, and which they chose to advocate the human rights of the Bahais of Iran, and in collaboration, obviously, with the Australian government and UN agencies. As a result of that, Australian community was recipient of influx of young Bahais from Iran who were fleeing from persecution, and they came to Australia with love for the faith and hope for better future and opportunity for service. I don't want to go and talk about what was the Australian community efforts was in this regard. I'm quite sure it will be discussed in future sessions, or what was the implication of that. The only thing, this gives me a good start to give you my story or our stories. Foad and I've been amongst those young people who came to Australia as a result of the persecution of Bahais of Iran. We obviously we were deprived of our basic human rights, education, security, job. And also we lost our member of family or close friends to fanaticism, which was prevalent at the time in Iran. So coming to Australia in 1984, and then we lived in Melbourne for 6 years, and we've completed our tertiary education in Melbourne. And then in 1991, we came to Canberra to start a new family. We just got married in 1990, and we wanted to start a new family there. The Canberra Bahai community provided us the perfect setting. For those of you who are much younger than myself, I just need to explain, at the time there wasn't any of those internet and emails or Skypes or WhatsApp. So the communication was not as easy as what we have today. And obviously the families could not support us as much as they wanted to do so. So we, the only support that we had, it was from the community. And obviously Canberra community, but coming to Canberra and new cities obviously provide give us challenges, and we felt lonely if we didn't have the support of the community and warmth of the community. The Canberra community at the time was a small community, roughly around 50, 60 believers with a strong assembly. who looked after the affairs of the community. Community was a lovely combination of people of different backgrounds with a strong community life. The vibrancy of the community allowed us to make lifelong friends and provided us with people we could rely on. As a couple working hard with 2 kids, we were supported many times by a number of different people, friends from the community who would reliably take care of our children while we were at work. The support that we received not only helped us financially, not only helped us for us to establish ourselves financially, but also helped us to feel stable emotionally. There were many young families similar to ourselves that we would share activity with them. Our children grow up together and are, at the moment, are best of friends. We started with a mother group in which one of us invited their friends and every one of us invited their friends, and over time we become very good friends. Michael, do you mind sharing that picture? This is a picture of a group of mothers at the time that each one of us had one or a couple of kids, and it was taken at Lemon's, Phil and Jennifer Lemon's residence. And in the picture we see, on the picture we see that, we see Tessa Scrine, our dear, our dear counselor. We see Ranjana that here with 2 boys. Also, we see Alison, who at the moment is in Perth. We see Susan, who's last week, I think Paul Layton gave some stories about his stay in Northern Territory, and Susan is married to Paul. And Jocelyn and Tahir Lemon are in the picture. I should say that, for example, Jennifer Lemon was very active at the time with children education and published a few children books. I'm quite sure her activities is much more than what I know, but that's all I can share at the moment. Next thing I just wanted to share is that hold on a minute. Our children grow up together and gone to children classes, and we had so many activities, regular activities. And I just wanted to share, this picture is the picture of the what parents with children who were in the, I think probably was one of the children classes celebrations. And it was in the temporary hall, which was built before the Bahai Center was built. And in the picture, quite a few members of community are there. We can see Paul and Catherine McMaster. Selma is here, an audience. I don't know if Paul and Catherine are. Jackie Lee Washington is one of the people here. Ranjana as well. There are quite a few members of community are here that Fanayan's family, Nilufar and Melody, their pictures are here. Paul Layton look very young in this picture. Anyway, it's a long time back, and it's such a good memory of those days. We, as a community, we started to have different regular activities. For example, to engage the wider community. And we, for example, had a teacher appreciation program every year. And this is this picture shows one of the those events where what children are getting ready to present their flower and quotation, Bahai quotation to their teacher that they invited to the event. And probably next picture shows that teachers on the stage are waiting for children to reach out and give them their gifts. This event was very much received by the teachers, and teachers are actually asked, teachers and principals actually asked to be invited, even though they were not teaching Baha'i children, but they were asking if they could be invited to the event. Another activity that we regularly had in our community was a Yamaha Celebration, where children were inviting their friends and their non-Baha'i and Baha'i friends to the activity. And this picture shows one of the those Yamaha parties, and which has got with activities outside the Baha'i Center. We see the building of the Baha'i Center here. It's Baha'i Center is been one of the greatest joy for A.C.T. Baha'i community, and everyone did lots of sacrifice to build this center. I'd like hand over this to Foad to give us more information about Baha'i Center and how the Baha'i Center came, what has been built.
Thank you, Parvaneh, and greetings to everyone. I try to be as brief as possible. First of all, it's so good to be with you. As Parvaneh mentioned, we arrived in Canberra in '91. One thing that we found interesting was the fact that the capital city has only one assembly, unlike other major cities. For example, before coming to Canberra, I lived in many different towns, or basically suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne, and they all had their own little assemblies. So that was an interesting aspect of this city. At that time, we didn't have a center of our own. We were hiring senior citizen centers, community halls to have Baha'i activities, from basically holding 19-day feasts to celebrating holidays. Children classes were being held at the school adjacent to the now Baha'i Center. As to the purchase of the land on which the Baha'i Center was built, I must say that like most things in the faith, it was a process, an interesting one. So many individuals dedicated their energies so selflessly to ensure that we get a block of land that has one of the best locations in Canberra. Frank Weiss, as you heard his name a couple of times, Phil Lemon, Mehru Mershahi, Farad Kubo, to name but a few. So I've got a couple of videos that I try to basically try to kind of fast forward, part of them to make it short. We can either show that towards the end or now. I mean, what do you think, Michael?
I think go ahead now. Well, that would be great.
Right now? Okay, then, sure. Okay. This is, as you can see, the date is there. I was filming this in September '93, and well, I'm just I try to be very descriptive, but I try to fast forward as much as I can. So this is the Bahai land, and today we have gathered here to do some cleaning, well, take some rubbish out and make the way prepared for the bulldozers to come and do the rest of the job. Today about 10 people have come. I don't know if we can see him. Yep, there are a couple of them over there. So hopefully next week everything will be going smoothly and perfectly according to the plan, and we just hope that the building will be built very soon, and we'll be here again filming the actual building. As you can see, the scenery around here is fantastic, just fantastic. And there is the telecom tower. And okay, now I'm just going a little bit forward to the part that is where these trees are, they mark the boundaries of the Bahai land, and well, this is where all the rubbish that we were talking about is. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a little range for the kids where they were playing, and where all these trees are, that actually marks the boundaries of the land. And I was filming before from the top of the land, so this from the down below. So you can see that it's a very vast area. Phil, did you say this is 8 acres, is it? Yes. 8.1, I think. 8.1 acres, which is a very huge land. So you're taking it from the top, you get it? I've already taken the tree. Has to be saved, that big tree. Which one? That one. That tree? Yeah. That's all the important tree we have to save. Okay. And that happens to be in the Bahai land as well, is it? Yes. Very well. Well, do you have anything to say?
We should start at our Bahai Center. Next week.
Oh, great.
So you can crawl in this hall and come out there.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. And I don't want to do it.
Okay, I stop it here. I think the last lady that we all saw was Monira, as Paul talked about her. The gentleman that I asked about the size of the block is Phil Lemon, one of the individuals who really played a major role in acquiring this piece of land. I've got another, let me just, a video clip that I'd like to share with you. Either we can, should I just show it now or towards the end? What do you think?
Is it the centre being under construction?
Yeah, this is.
Yeah. So just really quickly, because we're coming up on time. So just,
yeah, sure. Let me
it.
just quickly share this one. And yeah, it's.
This is on our property, and that stuff that the builder dumped there from another site which we're happy to have because we want lots of little plateaus so you can sit and meditate. Because in September we're going to plant trees also here. Wattle trees, gum trees, casuarinas, there's a whole heap of things. If you look straight over Parvaneh, there's a tree there, and right behind the tree is Parliament House. So you go this, you go up that side, you see between the two trees. I don't think we'll go any further because there were up there. There's a flat area in there. We may end up having it as a playing field for a while. That's covering on 3 Vogel Common across there. That's the Common Down Road here. And that's the Uriara Road, another way to Belconnen across there. So it's fairly accessible if you've got a car. It's a long way if you're going to walk. But from the road's a long way. Okay, we'll come through this track here. At flat level is where the main building is going to go.
Where's that? Over there.
And we're hoping that we're going to get so many people that we'll have a glass side and that third business will put seats in it to make it like an amphitheatre. That's one idea. Okay, this is the road coming up. You saw it from the entrance. You come up and this is the top car park. The road goes round. It's the second car park. The stone wall that you've all heard about is between the two car parks. The assembly has a problem because you're going to park your cars here, you're going to walk over to the multi-purpose building, they're going to have to decide on lights to it. So think about it whether you want little low lights on the footpath or big overhead lights, and give your recommendations to the feast so the assembly has something to think about.
So the gentleman that he was talking was Dr. Frank Weiss, as Paul talked about this wonderful individual. I don't know exactly when we purchased the land, but what I do know is that I think we were either the last or the second last religious group basically applying for the acquisition of blocks of land under the this act, you know, the church land, or maybe Michael knows better. But anyway, we were one of the lucky ones who managed to get one of the best blocks in Canberra. I think the construction began in early '94, late '93, '94, and finished in '97. Well, one of the things about the study.
Yeah, just time is an issue.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
Again, it feels so terrible interrupting, but if you can wrap up, just so.
Sure. I just wanted to say that, you know, lots of people contributed. A lot of, you know, people. Basically, it was once, you know, a national project. And, you know, at the national level, the NSA appointed John Walker, Hamid Majzoub, and Sohail Abedian, who was the architect. At the local level, we had Dr. Frank Weiss, Phil Lemon, and Farhad Kubur working on this. Anyway, everyone from Queensland, you know, to New South Wales, Melbourne, you know, just everyone, you know, contributed and did their bit. There are lots of things to talk about, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Parvaneh, for really taking us on a wonderful journey through a period of the history of the faith and such a, you know, it was like, you know, our children shared that journey with your children, and it's so special to be here and to be sharing this moment of reflection with you. And thank you, Fuad, also for sharing about the centre. It's so lovely to see and hear the voices of dear friends like Manira and Frank and many others. So thank you both very much for your presentation. I wish there was more time. Every speaker has had such wonderful things to share. Yeah, we'll move on to Natalie. So
thank you.
Thanks. Thank you both. So our final speaker tonight is Natalie Morbini. Natalie joined the faith in Melbourne in 1990, and she undertook her research and did her thesis on the history of the faith, of the Bahai faith in Indonesia. She's lived in a number of Bahai communities in Melbourne and Sydney. She lived there before she moved to Canberra in 2011. Natalie has served with the Office of External Affairs in Canberra for the past 10 years, and she was previously assisted in Sydney. And she doesn't want us to know for how long. She's currently serving as a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Bahais of Australia. So Natalie also is married and has 2 daughters.
Thank you very much, Michael and Ranjana. I've asked Michael if he can find a photo to put up of the completed Bahai Centre, the Bahai Centre today, so that those online aren't left thinking it remains a field. So he will, if he can find one, share that. Look, I was asked to share a little about Canberra as the national capital of Australia and the evolution of the faith's relationship with the national government. Thank you, Michael. So it is really a very beautiful centre, as those of you who visited will know. So yes, Canberra, of course, has the special distinction, as well as being a local community, of being the seat of national government and parliament. And Canberra Bahais have been aware of the responsibility that that carries and have contributed actively to the development of the faith's relationship with government. Now, some of the people on this call do know more about this than I do, including from first-hand experience, so I welcome corrections and supplementary information. As Ranja said, I'm a relative newbie to Canberra, having been here since 2011. And first thing to say, of course, is that the Australian Bahai community's relationship with government predates the establishment of the community in Canberra. If you read your messages to the Antipodes, you'll see that as early as 1925, Shohi Effendi was encouraging the Bahais and their assemblies to initiate communications with national and international authorities in defence of Bahais who were being persecuted elsewhere. And that's a pattern that has continued ever since that time, only 5 years since the arrival of the Duns. A second theme that has been present since very early in the faith's history in Australia was recognition of the importance of informing government about the character and activities of the faith. Again, you'll see in your messages to the Antipodes in 1940, which was only 6 years after the formation of our national governing body, the Assembly issued a statement on the Bahai attitude to war, months after the outbreak of the Second World War, which it provided to heads of government around the country. The Guardian Secretary observed that he was pleased to note the cordial response that had been received from the Prime Minister, the Premier of Victoria, and other ministers of the day. And this too has been a theme that has unfolded over the decades since. And I guess a third theme around the faith's relationship with government that also dates back from that early message has been the contribution and application of the teachings of the faith to issues in society with which government is grappling. Now I'm going to share screen. Let me just make sure that this is going to work for us. I'm hoping that if I do this, now. Is that now visible?
No, we just... Well done. It's happening.
Have we got it there? Okay, yes. I was hoping I was going to show it as a slideshow, but this might be the best that we're able to do. Okay, so in terms of developing relationships and structures to sustain them with government in Canberra, we owe much to this man who has already been mentioned tonight. This is an image of the younger Peter de Vogel, who became a Bahai in Canberra in 1956. And was a founding member of the Canberra Assembly when it was formed in 1957. And just a year later, in 1958, he took up his first national Bahai appointment as government liaison officer. And in that capacity, he participated in numerous presentations to many prominent people and government officials over the years, including to Prime Ministers Sir Robert Menzies and Harold Holt. Now these, and as I won't go into the further details which Paul shared about Peter later served on the National Assembly in Australia, in Belgium for a period of time pioneering, and then returned to Australia and service on the National Assembly from 1979 onwards. Now the great care that was taken in sharing, in developing these relationships bore great fruit. I'm just going to work out how to move on to my next photograph here. In the early 1980s, late 70s and early 1980s, at the height of the persecution of the Bahais in Iran, following the revolution there. And it was really through the efforts of Peter and his colleagues on the National Assembly that the Australian government took up the cause of the human rights of the Bahais in Iran, Parliament passing the first of many resolutions in 1981, and an allocation was created in the immigration program for Bahai refugees from Iran that same year, which paved the way for the entry of thousands of Bahais to Australia from Iran over subsequent years. So this photograph shows members of the National Spiritual Assembly of the time with the Immigration Minister, Ian McPhee. So from the left, we have Ray Meyer. Are we good? Okay, so from the left, you have Ray Meyer, Peter de Vogel, then Immigration Minister Ian McPhee, Beverly Stafford, and David Bailey. And this is one of a number of presentations that took place in those years in the early 1980s. Some of you will recognize Andrew Peacock in this photograph. And there's a third one here. I haven't been able to identify the government official. If you know your Australian political history, early 1980s, you might be able to help. But I did want to include this photograph because from left we have David Bailey again, Aflatun Payman, Beverly Stafford, Peter, and Ray Meyer.
That looks like Bill Hayden.
Ah, thank you, Graham. So Bill Hayden, then leader of the opposition, I suspect. Okay, and another highlight from of those relationships at that time in the presentation of the teachings of the faith was, of course, the dissemination of the promise of world peace, the message issued by the Universal House of Justice to the peoples of the world for the International Year of Peace. This is just another version of the photograph that Paul shared earlier, the presentation to the Governor-General of the day, Sir Ninian Stephen, by Stanley Bolton Jr., Joyce Stevenson, Paul's mother, of course, and Hand of the Cause, Collis Featherstone. This is a process, obviously, that happened to leaders of government and society at all levels through Australian society. I'm sure people on the call were involved in these meetings. Now, in his later years, Peter de Vogel was again an administrative pioneer in founding the Office of Government Affairs, working to create many opportunities for recognition of the faith in Canberra. He died in office in that role in 1995. It would be remiss not to also mention the work at this time of Lynn Lane, another Canberran who served as director of the National Bahai Office for the Advancement of Women and made a particular contribution to that broader movement for gender equality in Australia, and also herself served as a member of the National Assembly. The establishment of the Bahai Centre was a further significant step in representation of the community. As mentioned, it was a national project designed with the principle that it would serve not only as a local community centre, but as a fitting presence for the faith in the national capital. From the time of its official opening by Governor-General Sir William Deane in 1999, it has hosted many government delegations, receptions, conferences, and other events that have enhanced the relationship of the faith with government and civil society at the national level. And this work was continued, of course, by another of Canberra's well-known sons, Michael Curtotti, who's hosting us tonight, who at the request of the National Assembly established a full-time Office of Government Relations based from the centre in the late 1990s. And work that was then later continued by Tessa Skrind, who we've heard mentioned tonight, subsequently myself with the assistance of many other friends from Canberra, some of whom are here on this call. And this has brought us really to the point where we stand now on the centenary of the faith, where we have messages addressed to the Bahai community at each Rizvan, going back to by every Prime Minister since John Howard. There was a motion passed in the Parliament last year expressing the appreciation that the House considered the Bahai community a valued part of Australian society, commended the contribution that the community makes, and assured the faith, its leadership and members of their highest regard. Today we see some of this marked in an annual reception that takes place in the Parliament, and I'm just ending with a few photos of this from last year, because these are our most recent members of the National Assembly come to Canberra images. And in all of this process, you know, the community in Canberra has really often had the responsibility, but also the bounty of representing the Bahais of Australia as a whole, as they do on this occasion. So you see a number of the friends who are presenting here tonight, or who are present on the call, who've been engaged in that space, which now takes place within the Parliament building itself. This is a particular favourite. You know, this is our longest serving ever member of our national governing body, Fiona Mcdonald, who is a current member of the National Assembly, in warm embrace with a member of Parliament from her home state of Western Australia, who happens to be the first Muslim woman elected to the Australian Parliament, and it's a very, captures a lovely warmth, I think, in the relationship that exists there. So just very briefly in closing, I think we've seen how Canberra has grown up from the days of the very first believer to become really quite a vibrant and diverse community. It's been built by very strong believers from both West and East, sometimes a little too strong for everybody's own good, but that's another story altogether, and has continued to benefit from the flow of those who've come to our national capital to build up the city, to study and to work for government, which continues to be the case today. It's a community that's had a very strong history of engagement with the wider society as citizens, in public service, in the health and education sectors, and continues that work today. So I realise we're over time, I'll close at that point.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for that really informative presentation. And it's wonderful to see you taking on the baton that's been passed on to you and moving to greater achievements. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers, Helen, Paul, Parvaneh and Foad, for sharing your recollections of our Canberra story. And I thought we could spend the last 10-15 minutes if anybody had questions. I've been following the chat and there's lots of comments. So Graham, would you like to facilitate the questions and answers, or? what would you like to do?
Michael and Ranjana, you've been doing such a wonderful job. You can continue to do that. So as you say, this is a chance for some questions to come to our speakers or any other comments in brief from some of our other Canberra friends who are on the line tonight. I also just want to thank Michael and Ranjana for the wonderful job you've done in pulling together this presentation tonight. Thank you so much. But let's just spend a few minutes now to see if there are some questions for our speakers.
Thanks. Thanks, Graham. Well, yeah, if friends have questions, you can either put them in the chat box or just use your microphone to ask a question to any of our wonderful speakers. And just thanks again to all of them. They've taken us on a wonderful journey and really presented us many different dimensions of the experience of the Baha'i community in Canberra and its significance in the national capital. So we have a question. What was the name of the first Persian believer to arrive in Australia? Munira. So Munira was, I think, the first Persian believer to settle in Canberra for the long-term time. She and her family.
Can we?
Hello.
That you came as a family. Would you be able to share your experiences of arriving in Canberra from Iran? Farouk, yeah. Farouk Satiga,
yeah. Just a couple of comments. My first experience, I love our friends. And my first experience, we arrived in mid-1970, not 68. But I think that year we decided to go to Yarrambul, and that was sort of like a tumultuous experience because we wanted to catch a train there. We had to use public transport to get Yarrambul, and of course the train doesn't stop in Yarrambul, it sort of slows down. So when we saw the sign for Yarrambul, we all jumped off the train, and the train driver shouted to us that to get off the train line because another train was about to come very soon. Anyway, we got off the train line. This was getting dark. We didn't know where we were, how far we are from Yarrambul property. So we kept walking, and in the distance we could see lights, and we walked towards the car lights, and that was the Hume highway then. And then it was well and truly, it's about 8:30, 9 o'clock, and it was very dark, and we saw a car parked on the side of the road, and we walked towards that car, and it happened to be a police car. And the police, we told them where we wanted to go, and luckily they were really obliging, and they took us to Yarrambul, and there we were arriving in Yarrambul in the middle of the night, and I don't think they had the siren on, but everybody was worried that, why is the police car at Yarrambul? And anyway, Frank Khan was there, and he took us in and registered us, and we had a good time there. This was my experience, one of the first memories of arriving in Australia, virtually. And I also wanted to say something about the purchasing of the property at for the Bahai Center. It was it took many goes before it actually happened, and there was also a timeline that by that timeline the money had to be paid in full to be able to purchase that property. And it was through the sacrifice of many of the Baha'is that it happened. It was very difficult. It wasn't very easy. A lot of people had to make a lot of sacrifices to have the money to, first of all, to get the right property, and then once you got the right property, the money had to be paid virtually quite immediately. Otherwise, you would lose that option. That's it.
Thank you so much, Farouk. And it's very much, it was an amazing endeavour for such a small community at the time. In the chat, where Judy Hassel has been mentioned, and just also want to acknowledge her. Also, she was an amazing mentor in external affairs. She's both for Natalie and myself, and for many years led the external affairs process and public information for the Baha'i community. And of course, her dear family are here this evening, including Graham. Also, Diana Stevens is with us here tonight. Diana, if you wanted to share anything about your mum, Pim Truman. Helen mentioned her as a Baha'i who was present here in Canberra when she declared. Diana? Okay, so Diana's saying...
Hello. Just wait a minute. Yes, hello. Yes, it's been most interesting tonight. I just wanted to, I don't really have a lot to say about our time in Canberra, because I was only a child of age 3 till 6. So I remember some family things, you know, we all got the measles, we all got the mumps, we had chicken pox, and there were 3 young children, and my mother had a 4th child while we were living there. So pretty busy with family stuff, but I do know that she was a very much excited about the faith, because she came across the faith in Perth, in Adelaide, but became a Baha'i in Perth in 1949. And my dad got a job with the government in Canberra, which is what takes people quite often to Canberra. And we moved there when I was 3 years old, and it was in 1951. So by doing so, she became the first Baha'i to actually live there. And I remember she told us a story about meeting, I think it was Helen and Margaret, and a few other things, just names occasionally, but I know she started children's classes in our home. And she also got involved with something called the Good Neighbourhood Council. And also she took an interest in the Esperanto Club. So they're the only things that I can remember other than family stuff. But she was always one to look out in the community, to look for opportunities to serve. And she continued that the rest of her life, wherever she lived, in Melbourne, Tasmania, whatever. So yes, and she passed away in Tasmania a few years ago.
Thank you, Diana. And Pim, your mum, was also a great contributor in external affairs. I recall she did a lot of work in the peace field and with other community organisations as well. So yes, lovely to have you with us, Diana. And
thank you.
For sharing.
Just for interest sake, she was awarded an Order of Australia medal for her work in peace, human rights, and interfaith dialogue. So that was sort of such a wonderful recognition of all her years. She was very humbled by that, but the family was very excited, of course, for her.
Thanks so much, Diana. It's wonderful. I see Johan has shared something of serving with with Peter de Vogel and John Stevenson. Would you like to share something about that, Johan?
Well, Paul might like to as well, perhaps, but yeah, Peter was a very dynamic man. My father was a Dutch Baha'i migrant, but very charismatic, very smart, very strong, and there's a couple of connections with people here, with meeting in Graham's home, and with John's son Paul Stevenson being online. It's wonderful to be reminded of some of these legendary Baha'is like Judy and and Peter de Vogel. Very lucky to be old enough to have, and Frank Bliss as well. I lived in Canberra in 1988 and 1990 where I was working as a lawyer and studying international law at the ANU. So very lucky to have been around long enough to meet these great early Bahais.
Thanks so much, Johan. And
Michael.
Catherine, go ahead.
Michael.
Yes.
Yeah, can I?
Hi,
yes,
everybody.
thank you, Michael. I have two questions. Is it me?
Yeah, if you can go ahead first, and then Catherine, I think you have something to share too.
I had one question. Thank you, Michael, and aloha to everyone. I had one question. I think I've said this, but I like to say about the Peter de Vogel. The question in this paradoxon, your uncle told me what was the land cost and how close was 1984, he told me. How close was to losing it because money was not there. Can you elaborate what was the cost of the land, please?
I don't have a good memory for that sort of thing, but it was very sizable for that small community.
Yeah. I don't think it was sizable, Michael. It wasn't sizable. That's the reason I'm asking if my memory is correct. The other thing it is, after you left the Randwick, you were in Randwick for a while, we met Peter de Vogel with the beloved Judy Hassel. And in that meeting, assembly met, and Peter said he used to walk in the hotel. When he met Father Don asked him a question, where do you work? And Peter said, I work in the hotel. Then he asked, is there any alcohol involved in the hotel? And his answer was yes. And Peter said the day after that meeting, he went and resigned. He didn't work in the hotel anymore. This was 1989, I think, when we met him.
Today we talk about, thank you so much, Jenkins, for those reflections. Today we talk about life of coherence, and it's a beautiful example of that. So
Michael?
Yeah.
Couple of things.
I think Catherine wanted to share something.
So go ahead, Catherine.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everybody. I want to share a story. We got to Canberra in 1987, and my husband-to-be was in the Navy and wasn't a Bahai, and would make numerous trips to Canberra for his work, and the community here was very welcoming, including a young Graham Hassel, who hosted and was very hospitable to Paul in his home and in Graham Hassel's house. So I just wanted to mention that. It was really, really important time in our lives, and it was a wonderful, welcoming and warm community, and it felt like most of the community drove to Adelaide for our wedding, and so that was really wonderful as well. So it was a wonderful community to become a part of in the late 80s. Yeah, so there we go. Just a little story about a young Graham Hassel. Thanks, Graham. Good work. Well done. Check's in the mail.
Thank you, Catherine. It's beautiful reflections. There was someone else who wanted to share?
Yeah, just a couple of points, Michael, before someone else fade away very soon. Hopefully not too soon, but soon. I'm saying this not in the frame of question. Just a couple notes about the Bahai Center. I hope somebody can do some more groundwork, keep some of the archive material, and interviewing some of the people who still alive. So that people who are really involved with this project, just for the sake of because it's a national capital, and also we love the center very dearly. The other thing to local history, the Bahai history like Queanbeyan and Canberra is always interlinked. Paul Stevenson did mention something on that. Obviously there's a lot of gap as well. I mean, like all the story, with this sort of limited time, you can't tell the full story. So I suggest somebody aspiring historian, might be Graham Hassel, I don't know. He's more in a wider field probably, to make some sort of record if not writing it, at least some of the archival or some of the material we should be able to prepare. Even the LSA material from Queanbeyan, right way back to the 70, early 70, when I was there too, when Paul was there too. I'm not sure still there. So this sort of thing, which hopefully for future aspiring historian can write some more thing on it. Might be the next 100 years when the history of the faith can be written. So this is a lot gap can be filled, and local Bahai history can be more fully written and appreciated. This is one thing. The other thing is about Monera. The first time when I came, sure, I met the first family I met is the Monera and Farouk. The first Bahai I met, apart from Paul, and I think even before Paul, I met Paul and Burnham. Later on, changes into Burnham. This is Farouk. Farouk is here tonight, which is that was really coincident where I met him in my school where I taught at Tolopapa High School. He was there, I think, doing year 11 or year 12. I think it might be year 12. Yeah, his final year. And he invited me. His mom invited me, or his family invited me for the barbecue. This is the first Bahai family I met in Canberra. Those are very, very different. I think a lot of gap need to be filled in the activity, the Bahai activity, especially in Canberra and Queanbeyan. And moving on from the 70s to 80s, and this one 90s, there's a lot more people came to Canberra. This is where I think a lot more material. In the 80s, not too bad. We still got a lot of them. Even the children classes we talk about, even in the 80s, my wife get involved with Wahime was his counselor. Later on, he became counselor. The husband, what's his name? Kingston. Yes. Thank you. They started off, and also Nick and what's his name here? I think I've written down somewhere. And Susie Flink from England. We started with a family like Parvaneh said. Kids. We started with the children sort of play group before the formal children classes started. I think this is sort of thing need to be mentioned because which is the LSA and also the pioneer, the children classes at the AME school. Remember the time the AME school now become Orana school, just across us when we had the land. And Hatami, not Jamshi Hatami, what's his brother name? Sorry?
Farid Hatami.
Farid, yeah. And the LSA to the time they get so involved with the children classes, the emphasis of that, which is that should be mentioned because it's so important for our youth, even our children. I think even Parvaneh can witness a lot of generations, or 2 or 3 generations, or at least 2 anyway, that going through Canberra. Some of them is nowhere else here in Canberra. Most of them moving on to other cities. So I hope that we still can keep on going for years and years to come. Children class. Now we had our Bahai Center. So all right, these are the 2 points. Thank you very much.
Thanks so
Wellen,
much.
thank you for that. I'm so pleased to see Wellen Leong online. I was going to intervene and say, Wellen, you should introduce yourself as well.
Oh, I'm too busy on something else, Graham, at the moment.
You've done a wonderful job.
I'm more involved with other things. I wish you later on probably anyway, I can discuss with you later on down the track. I had a lot of other projects which unfortunately I've got tied up for the last 6 or 7 years. So, okay, keep going. And I still remember you, Graham. And you remember that in Canberra too, we host 2 or 3 very important conferences. The youth conference, which Paul, I think he was involved with the first one. The second one, Scott Stafford and me and a few other Bahais in Canberra, 1975. And college, what's called?
June 23rd. June 23rd.
23rd, yes. It's a Catholic college, a resident college. Graham, you were there. You were still young looking then. I mean, I still remember.
I didn't sleep at that conference, Wellen. Well, that's wonderful. I think I want to thank Michael and Ranjana for, as I said, for convening tonight. I think it's become clear that there's so much more that we can learn from the Canberra Friends about their community, both in the past and in the present. There's been a lot of chat on our chat column, requesting more information and more time. And there's nothing to stop the Canberra Friends from hosting another of these evenings and inviting us all along so that we can learn some more. We thank you so much for the preparation you've put into this evening. Catherine, I do remember the night that you and Paul came over, even though it's so many years ago. I remember that. I remember Wellen. I remember Johan at my house, and of course my dear friend Paul Leighton from those days, and all the other Canberra Friends who are still online tonight. I remember those days back from the 80s. I want to mention, Sitere Alai has mentioned in the chat about Colleen Dawes. Michael had asked me if I had anything that I wanted to say about my few years in Canberra. And the one recollection I had was that Vuffer Payman was there working, I think in the Attorney General's Department. And I was at ANU. And one night I met Vuffer and he said, Graham, I'd like you to meet my friend Colleen. And Colleen was sitting playing the piano. And she just said, hello, Graham, and kept playing the piano. And now all these years later, we're so pleased to see that Colleen has ended up not only joining the Baha'i community, but becoming the Chief Legal Officer for the Universal House of Justice for maybe 2 decades or more. So my recollection is seeing Colleen as in much younger years. So many, many memories for me tonight, as well as for everybody online. We do have to bring this session to a close. Thank you all for coming online. We hope that in a week's time, we will see you all again in this series celebrating the centenary of the Baha'i faith in Australia. Thank you so much.
Great. Oh.